Welcome back to Philosophy of Mind. We looked at the eliminativist objection to Cartesian materialism given by Dennett's multiple drafts model. And now we need to look at what a scientist might do to try to explain the Cartesian theater in physical terms. So if you really do think there is something that is consciousness that you want to try to explain, as the scientist does, then you need to try to figure out how to respond to the two objections that the multiple drafts model laid against Cartesian materialism, and you need to try to develop a theory about the difference, what Blackmore calls the magical difference between unconscious processing and conscious processing. So in looking at the Dehaene et al. Article for today, you may have had difficulty reading the science of the material. Now you know why we needed to learn a little bit about how the brain works in order to be able to read scientific theories, the neuroscience of consciousness. And so we're going to spend some time today. I'm going to read some parts of the article to try to help you further negotiate how a neuroscientist tries to explain consciousness, how the ways in which Dehaene and company lay out their theory of consciousness fits with some of the ways that we've been talking about consciousness, and to try to connect those different approaches to how consciousness is considered. In reading an article like a neuroscience article or other science articles, it's important to have the kinds of skills of effective reading that we've talked about. Survey is particularly important in reading science. Oftentimes I'll just look at the abstract and look at the main headings and read the discussion section, and that can be sufficient for me as a non-scientist to get what I need out of the science article. And this is particularly useful that you are able to go to the original science articles, because a lot of stuff that comes through Facebook or Instagram or Reddit is a kind of gloss, a media gloss on what the actual science is. And so it's useful to be able to go to the science itself, to go to the original articles, which are often online and accessible. As a PSU alum, you should be able to get through the library access to most original articles in perpetuity. So that's a great bonus for you. So you need to be able to read these articles and figure out what's going on. So the survey aspect of effective reading strategies is really, really useful. So let's start with the abstract. The abstract is one of the most important parts of an article, because it lays out all the key bits that are going to be in the article. It gives you a nice summary. So I'm just going to read this and highlight some of the things that are going to be discussed in the article, and what I'll pull out in particular from this article. The study of the mechanisms of conscious processing has become a productive area of cognitive neuroscience. Here we review some of the recent behavioral and neuroscience data with the specific goal of constraining present and future theories of the computations underlying conscious processing. So their goal is to say, look, these are the data, this is what's going on, and this is going to limit how we're going to explain consciousness going forward. Experimental findings imply that most of the brain's computations can be performed in a non-conscious mode, but that conscious perception is characterized by an amplification, global propagation, and integration of brain signals. So they're saying here we've got this contrast between non-conscious processing and conscious processing involves this amplification and propagation. All right, so this is going to give you a hint about what their distinction is going to be. A comparison of these data with major theoretical proposals suggests that, firstly, conscious access must be carefully distinguished from selective attention. Secondly, conscious perception may be likened to a nonlinear decision that ignites a network of distributed areas. Thirdly, information which is selected for conscious perception gains access to additional computations, including temporary maintenance, global sharing, and flexible routing. And finally, measures of the complexity, long-distance correlation, and integration of brain signals provide reliable indices of conscious processing, clinically relevant to patients recovering from coma. All right, so 4 different proposals. I'm not going to go into a lot of the specifics of these proposals. I'll highlight a couple of them as we go forward, but this gives you the overall sense that even if you don't understand all of the particular terms that are addressed in this abstract or in the article itself, you get a sense of what the structure of the article is and what the general claims are in the article. Also important is to look at definitions that different theorists are proposing. So particularly with consciousness, we've talked about the difficulty of defining consciousness, and so it's useful to look at the definition that Dehane and company offer in thinking about what consciousness is. They talk about consciousness as several different kinds of distinctions, but I'm going to pull out a couple. Content of consciousness is, quote, the information that I am aware of at a given moment. So the information I am aware of at a given moment is how they define the contents of consciousness. And compare that with our definition of phenomenal consciousness. That's our target that we're trying to explain what it's like to have an experience. What it's like to have an experience is fairly similar to information that I'm aware of. There's this general sense of awareness. The content of consciousness that they're proposing is more informational. It sounds a little bit more cognitive than what it's like as more general and experiential. So keep paying attention to that as we go forward. They also talk about the notion of conscious access. How information becomes conscious is their definition of conscious access. And remember that Bloch, in articulating the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, particularly said that access consciousness was not the target, that reportability of your thoughts and experiences is separate from phenomenal consciousness. And this is an ongoing debate between Bloch and Dehane as they get to consciousness conferences and argue with each other. So this is something to be paying attention to in looking at the theory and thinking about its plausibility as a theory of consciousness. So they want to say that conscious access is important. Information becomes conscious by virtue of this access that information has. And we'll see exactly how that works in the global workspace theory as we articulate their claims. They also say that I can report something if and only if I am aware of it. So there's this bi-directional relationship between reporting and consciousness. If it's reportable, then it's conscious. If it's conscious, then it's reportable. This is a very, very strong claim, and you can ask yourself if you think it's really plausible. Can you report everything that you're conscious of, or are there aspects of your consciousness that are not reportable, that you really can't articulate at all? Sometimes this is talked about as consciousness outruns reportability, that there's more consciousness than you can conceive of and report. So think about that. That's part of your journal exercises, to pay attention to your experiences and try to see how they match up with some of these theoretical descriptions of consciousness. So this is how Dehane and company are articulating what consciousness is. The target is the contents of consciousness, and it becomes conscious, things become conscious through this process of access.